I'm here, and it's starting again, and it's happening again, and I'm here. And I want to try to focus on just talking about, at least for a bit, just talking about the way I feel right now, or the closest I can get to right now, rather than going into like whatever kind of, what I perceive to be like this kind of tumultuous emotional back and forth that I've kind of been at the whim of for the past little bit, because there are a million things I could say about that, and that I will, you know. I don't think it's something just because an event is in the past and the state of mind no longer applies, it's like, doesn't mean that should just be ignored and kind of regarded as ugly or anything. But yeah, it's just like right now everything is so okay, and any like inkling of like non-okayness or like less than okayness can only come to me if I'm like borrowing it from meditations on like the past or the future, you know? Like if I'm borrowing these feelings of discomfort from this like conception that I'm holding up in my head of like a real past and a real future, and things that happen in my past that point to a trend that might lead me to conclude that like a period of okayness or happiness will be followed by a period of non-okayness or unhappiness. And so it's like, in one sense, it's completely logical to conclude that will happen again, and then that is like something that I would then be warranted in anticipating a little bit anxiously, you know? It's like I keep my guard up, you know? I keep my guard up so as not to be so blindsided by like a mental crash if such thing does happen, which it's like, again, if I draw from the past, which I don't know if that's the right thing to do, that kind of does seem to be the trend and the theme, and that does seem to be something I can like reasonably expect to happen again after this period of okayness and well-being and happiness. But there's also the approach, and that I'm feeling more associated with now, is that like you're just completely like, you're removing from the beauty of this feeling of like relative tranquility and peace. You're removing from that, and you're like minimizing it, and you're lessening it by like fretting about its end, and by holding it up in your head primarily as something to lose rather than something to experience now and something to just relish in, you know? And this is something that I like to do non-stop. It's like that's all I can seem to do, you know? But I've noticed that recently I've gotten a little bit better at just feeling like allowing myself to be immersed in whatever mental state I'm in. And when it's a good one, then, you know, full immersion is a good thing. But when you're feeling terrible and wretched and miserable, full immersion isn't such a good thing, but it's like, it's hard to even avoid, you know? It's like, in that case, it's a negative characteristic to not be able to see outside of this state of mind. And when you're feeling like, you know, fragile and insecure, and like everything in the world is wrong with you, so naturally do you, at least in my experience, So naturally, do you like extrapolate that to apply to everything in the world, or everything in your world, you know? And like you generate this tendency of like hypersensitivity, of like being so extremely bothered by like, you know, the smallest of things and actions, and like feeling a piece of the suffering that you perceive that like everyone you go by passes, or like everyone in like a less than like ideal situation, or like if you are passing through somewhere and you see someone working a job where like just by their body language, or by their like the way that they seem to be conducting themselves, it's like you almost like fill yourselves into their shoes and imagine that they aren't happy with it and that you wouldn't be happy with it either, and you feel that kind of like sledgehammer of like pain, or a little bit of it that you imagine they must experience. But the thing is that I take that at such like face value, like I take that to just be the truth. So it's like if I imagine that, you know, so-and-so person is like, I'm feeling a piece of their suffering because I'm feeling bad, I just don't even question whether or not that's actually their reality, you know? I'm just like, oh yeah, that's exactly how they feel. But it's such like a flawed way to go about like seeing stuff, and it's so easily lends to like the like solidification of this mindset, whether it's conscious or not, that like your perception kind of trumps all, you know? Like as if like the way that I feel in my like ever-changing mental whatever, emotional topography, it's like the way that I feel in that informs the way that I feel about others, or about others in their situation, or about things in the world, or about just like the nature of being alive. And then but it's like it's like a lot of times I don't even have like the breadth of experience and thinking to question whether or not it's a little short-sighted to extrapolate this like very temporary mindset to everything, you know? But already I'm feeling like I gotta cut this train of thinking and speaking off, because already it's like it's getting me into something that it's like I find a lot of times when I do this activity, I rely on these like past tropes in my head, you know, rather than doing the hard work of trying to make sense of the present and the now, because it's like the present and the now hasn't been solidified yet, and it isn't past yet. So it's like it hasn't yet been like put into this, like it hasn't been compartmentalized and like put into this box of like experience. And this, like, I feel like I create these boxes of like experiences I've had, and whether or not they, you know, whether or not they kind of subscribed or fall in line with like, you know, the one state of mind and then the opposite and everything in between. But I can't do that with the present moment, because the present moment is not over yet, and it is ongoing, and it can still be like, there's still choice involved, you know? It isn't like a solid thing yet. And so I can't fit it into any of these like narratives that I have. And then I notice when I try to commit myself to like only talking about right now and trying to talk outside of these narratives about how I feel so strongly about how it is, which is like also so empty and fleeting, because it's like in my talking about how you can't really have like full conviction on something because it's all partial, I'm so impartial and I'm so convicted that that's the case. So it's like I'm noticing these kind of meta rules that I'm violating, and in my noticing of them I'm violating the same rules. And it's like, whatever, I mean, you can't really do it. That's like just a paradox that you can't really do much about. But I guess it is to say that, like, if I really try to be conscious and not trying to fit everything I'm saying into this narrative of what I think stuff is about and what I think stuff is like, the words and the ideas flow much less effortlessly, and they require much more effort to keep going. It's like I'm almost inclined to just like stop and think about it. Like, how do I feel about right now? You know, how do I feel about right now? In a way that isn't at all informed by my past, and isn't at all informed by like where I conceptualize this moment to fit into like my trajectory of life, or just the trajectory of time, you know, like this is like a moment in time, and like and how that fits into like the calendar year, or like the seasonal year. It's like just disregarding all of that and trying not to be informed by any of that. It's like, how do I feel about right now? And even like trying to disregard the things that are like freshest in my memory, because in like in my personal life, I could so easily go into like, you know, vivid detail about the way I feel about things and how that's informed by like events in my personal life, you know, because it's like we all kind of have that like uncomfortable selfishness about that leads us to care. I don't know. It's like the stuff going on in all of our lives is really like the number one informant in how we're like assessing reality. It kind of feels like. I don't know if that's really true. Maybe for me a little bit. You know, because it's like so many times have I like felt that everything is so abundant, and there's such an abundance of experiences to be had, and growth to be made, and like, you know, revelations to be found and revealed, and that like that kind of imposes on me this like positive valence through which I like look at everything, and through which I turn a blind eye to all of the things that in other states of mind, maybe 2 days before, 2 days prior, or 2 days afterwards, would just absolutely destroy me, and would fit into my like my narrative of like, this is how terrible things are, and here's an example, you know. Like all of the many aspects of reality and of human nature and of like the world as it is right now is like that you can point to support any like to support some perspective that you have that like everything sucks and humans are flawed, kind of beyond savior, and the ugly and the wretched far outweigh whatever like partial goods there are that exist. All of those things become like, they become almost like invisible when you're under the spell of like a mania, or not even like a mania, like when you're under the spell of just like because mania I feel like implies like an off-kilter, like unhealthy dose of dopamine and happiness, and like, you know, having to do with like ultimately negative like disorders or like drug use or anything, like literally just instead of a mania, just like a naturally earned or healthy experience or period of like well-being and happiness in your life. It's like when you're under the spell of something like that, one of those periods of well-being, it's like so quickly do all these things that you're so sensitive to when you feel terrible, so quickly do they become invisible to you, you know? And they become, or like maybe not even invisible, like they become, you still see them as like, you know, real manifestations in like the external world, but you no longer like apply this like this judgment of value or morality or like goodness versus evilness onto them. And so that, like, if this happens enough times, you start to notice the kind of the quality in all of these things that is their lack of any certain quality, and their lack of like a one solid thing that you can like box them in with. And this applies to a lot, and it becomes iffy when it's like you start to talk about like, you know, if you just for the sake of argument you bring up like the worst evils that you can imagine, you're like, well, is this also like is the way that you view this, like, is it also like qualitatively malleable? Like, can you also just say that this is only bad from a certain perspective? And then it's like it gets a little personally uncomfortable, because you don't want to insinuate that, like, you know, something like just like an innocent murder is like only bad from a certain perspective or something like that. And that's not like, it's not real, it's not what I mean by this. What I do mean is that like each thing doesn't, like, no thing really has, like, it feels like at least like a solid quality as far as goodness or badness or anything in between, and that can always change. And then it's like, that's why so often is the conclusion made following this line of thinking that like there's what's really intrinsic to these things and what's really like qualitative to them is just like a sort of emptiness, you know, because there's like no solid quality of substance that you can apply to them that will last the test of time and the tests of like shifting mindsets and moods. It's like, sure, you can say something about something and feel strongly that assertion will hold up for a little bit, but it's like, I really do believe that like if you keep an eye on that and you keep trying to apply that assertion, eventually you'll begin to feel it slipping a little bit. And it doesn't have to just like, it doesn't have to turn into its polar opposite, but it's like you'll feel it flip around, maybe, or not flip around, but just you'll feel it move in some way. And then you'll realize that like it's kind of all these like assertions you're applying to things that are empty of any like solid quality or solid like they aren't really capable of housing any real assertions without losing them. And then it's like, then does one come to the conclusion that like, oh, these things are empty. But the emptiness thing is so interesting, and it's so like, it's so deeply scary to me, or like for a long time it was, and now I view it less as a scary thing, because it's like, or a depressing thing, because even those assertions, it's like you're actually just fulfilling the exact same thing that we're kind of dispelling any validity of. We're like kind of saying there's no validity in using like an emotionally charged conviction and applying that to like a thing, you know, whether it's like a real thing or a concept. And then after we do that, we might claim, but this emptiness is scary and depressing. And it's like, if you think about it clearly, it's like that's just fulfilling the same prophecy and the same fallacy as we're viewing it. You know, it's like, it's the same fallacy to claim that emptiness is like a thing that belongs to the wretched, and a thing that is like an adversary or an enemy, because that's also just like a assertion that you're making, informed by whatever mood you're in, or just informed by your lack of time, like trying to grapple with this concept of emptiness. And it seems to be the case that, like, with more time grappling with this concept, you'll realize too that, like, this idea of emptiness can't really be pinned down as like a negatively balanced thing, or a positively balanced one. It's like the same thing. But it is interesting in that, like, I think a very easy way to think about it, or at least for me, there's like a tendency to think about this emptiness in like a like to view it manifest in like bureaucratic or like commercial ways, you know? And like, I'm not sure that that's exactly the same sort of emptiness, because the kind of ultimate emptiness is like, the idea is that it like trumps all. So like, even if you feel like you're living true to your soul, it's like, or you're living true to your soul and you're living authentically, and you're like, whatever, you're rejecting convention, and you're you know, following your heart, and like all these very tropey things that also have some like validity and like warranted allure to them, they too kind of are at the whim of this emptiness, at least in theory. But kind of on the contrary, I've like kind of thought for a long time that like this emptiness being referred to is just like the emptiness of like positions in like in like an industry, or like the positions that someone has, you know, like they are, you know, chief of operations at you know, Oreo Co., you know, Oreo Inc., Oreo Enterprise, and like, and then like acknowledging that there is at least the illusion of a structure that one would have to climb in order to achieve such a status, you know what I mean? Like, there's the illusion of like, well, in order to become chief executive at Oreo Incorporated, you need to first have achieved these prerequisites, and you need to first have achieved like you know, whatever is kind of the second in command. Or maybe you made a quick ascent, but that ascent was still within this structure of like how things are run around here or around there. And it's just like, I don't know, it's just like approaching that from the outside and like feeling very clearly that like none of that exists, none of that like really exists, but also understanding that like within this kind of illusion, it's like, it's logical and it makes sense. But that's one of those things that it's like, it's very flimsy, and it's easy to poke holes in like these kind of like status positions that we've created. And I guess my point is that in alignment with like the belief of this ultimate emptiness, everything can have everything can have holes poked in it, but some things are much easier than others, you know? Like it's much harder to poke holes, and that is to say, like, poke holes meaning like counter or like invalidate or show how that, like, show the illusion in whatever the thing is that it's having holes poked in it is like, it's much harder to or it seems much harder to poke holes in something like a person's disposition, which is that like living in alignment with you know, your identity and your sexuality and like what you feel to be the most true and like amazing thing for you, regardless of like the way it is viewed in whatever like mainstream society, or like, you know, if you go years back, the way it was viewed in like, I don't know. It's much harder to poke holes in that because that seems like a truly and deeply meaningful and amazing thing, and maybe it is. And this isn't me setting up to say that, well, that's also empty, although that's also like, that's an approach. You can approach it like that's empty too. But even if, just for the sake of argument, we're supposing that like all of that, including this tendency to like live in accordance with your best self or whatever, if we're supposing that too is empty, it does seem that there's like a different level of like resistance to the emptiness in that than there is with like than there would be in response to someone trying to poke holes in like the validity or the reality of like a position, like a higher up position at Oreos Incorporated. It's like that is something that is much easier to shun and to make fun of and to say is just like an absurd and satirical manifestation of like this strange kind of this strange like arbitrary system that we've created. It's much easier to ascribe emptiness to that than to something that is in alignment with like, you know, following your heart. And I'm not sure what that is to say. I mean, it's like it creates a little bit of a it at least seems to create a little bit of like a hierarchy of like, you know, a hierarchy of like certain things and the extent to which they withstand the test of emptiness that supposedly applies to all things, and, you know, the extent to which, or the duration for which they resist being indoctrinated as like just another byproduct of emptiness, you know. But I'm also not sure that this hierarchy is this hierarchy is like something that we can believe to be true either. And I'm getting like a sense that this is kind of, even though it feels like I'm making clear points, maybe, or at least like it feels like I'm making sense on the surface or something, it's like it's still limited by my needing to like say things in words that string together and are understandable. And it's like it feels a little bit like I would achieve like a higher, more transcendent level of communication if I were able to communicate like just like senses that I get, you know, just like senses being like just like feelings I get from like just like tiny noises in music, you know, and my like the tendency to like tie those feelings and then those sensations from these noises and music, to tie those into like a narrative of like how things are, but a narrative that can't be like really conveyed, and so it appears at least less flimsy and easily destructible, you know. I think that's the word. It like at least seems that these narratives that we build up just based on sensation and that aren't formed by words, and they aren't attempted really to be recreated by words, they seem to have like more depth to them. But again, that's like there's also another side of like that's also iffy, because I don't know, it's the same thing where it's like I say that and then I think of all the times that I've read something that is formed by words that, at least to me, seems clearly to be alluding to some like grander, like transcendent sensation, or like, you know, profundity. And you can in fact get like a taste of it if the right words are used and they're put in the right order, and they fit into the right context. But it's like a very difficult thing to do, you know? And it's almost like frustratingly difficult to the point that it might just inspire a person to like retract into themselves and just, you know, experience this profundity that they have by themselves, and no longer like dabble in this practice of like trying to communicate it to anyone else, and also no longer dabble in the practice of trying to receive a communication of profundity from another person, you know, which you could argue that is like the point of like why people like look at art or like consume art in whatever form, you know. It's like they're trying to receive at least little bits of profundity that whoever made the art supposedly felt and experienced and used to inform the creation. And that's also why people make it, for the exact same reason. You know, it's just like they feel a need to express these things to people, which is why it's so interesting, because it's like it does seem kind of like I don't know, you could get close to saying it's like it's human nature to have this desire to express like our experience of profundity to another, and not to just sit on it and keep it bottled up. But I don't know if it's really human nature. I mean, it's definitely like a common tendency, but I'm sure, I mean, this is like where like the whole argument of like, you know, how many unknown geniuses have there been, you know? That's where that comes in, because it's like, well, first of all, there's the amount of people who were just in such unfortunate external circumstances that they didn't even have like the ability to communicate their art with anyone, you know? And like they just didn't even have the ability to like maintain enough health to even do so, or just survive long enough to get to a point where they can do that. And there are also like the other category, I guess, of like kind of unseen genius throughout human history, is all of the however many people that, you know, even though they did have technically the ability, and like they were like, you know, they were in circumstances where they were able to eat food on a consistent basis and like survive without constant question, they just chose not to, or they were either unaware of their genius or they were aware of it and they just chose not to like integrate it with the public, you know? It's kind of funny actually, because it's like you can imagine that there are some people who are just, or have been some people who have just been like so remarkably intelligent that it's like almost painful for them to like interact with like people in the real world, you know? Which in that way, it's like that has to be more of a curse, you know? But I don't know, because I don't experience that, and neither do like 99 whatever extremely high percentage of people, you know? But yeah, it's like there have to have been some people, and probably still living some people, who are just like so fucking intelligent that it's like the thought of trying to like communicate the profundity that they experience is like a painful one, like trying to communicate it to just like the average person to consume it. And even trying to communicate it to like circles of like, you know, art circles, or like circles in like academia, or like anything which are supposedly filled up with like very smart people. It's like still they're so like cursed with this like disproportionate intelligence that they don't even like see any allure to like any of like the prestiges of like art, you know, because any of the prestiges that can be given to someone who makes art, of like, you know, being displayed in like such and such gallery, or like being awarded such and such honor, or like prestigious reward or amount of money, or grants, or like residencies, or any of that. It's like imagining a person who is so like impossibly intelligent, and thus removed from all that just none of the incentives that seem to motivate others in the world like do anything for them. Like that's I think that's insane to think about. And and the funny thing though is that if there were to be like, it's like you can't really say that this is just hypothetical, because the fact that there aren't really any like, I mean I don't even know what I'm talking about, but the fact that I think there aren't any real like documents of such a person that was so like, I mean I know there are like, there's the trope of like the tortured genius, but like a person who was so unbelievably like above all that they didn't even care about like anything like recognition or you know, public support or honor, or like anything that like incentivizes or that would incentivize most people to do stuff. Like if there really existed a person like that, we wouldn't know about it, because if we did, that would be kind of like, that would be contradicting the whole idea of what they're like, you know. Like there wouldn't be documentation of a person like this, because supposing that they had control over how their legacy was seen, and that they kept their genius secret from, you know, their family or those closest to them, because they knew that would be like, you know, it would be impossible for those closest to them and their family not to like not to try to like monopolize, and not even in like a manipulative, selfish way, but like not to try to be like, John, you gotta show this to someone, this is the most gorgeous thing I've read / viewed / listened in my whole life, you know. It's like, even that is like, they're smart enough that they wouldn't let that happen, right? So it's like we just truly wouldn't know about them. If this like super genius didn't want to be known about, and if they produced work, they didn't want their work to be viewed, even posthumously, then like likely it wouldn't be. But that's, I don't know. I mean, I'm sure like a lot of people, if they like heard this, they could like interject with historical examples of like, you know, figures who, because I mean it is like a trope of like kind of someone who's regarded as like a genius, or like a father figure, a founding father, whatever the hell it is, within their respective field of art or literature or whatever it is, or like study or anything. there is the trope of like these people who like created a work that ultimately became like, you know, regarded as like everything and as like extremely important, but never actually received that recognition within their life. And I guess like you could argue that that fits into this idea of like the genius who didn't even care about this, but I don't know if that's true, because a lot of times it seems to be the case, like, you know, with like certain authors, or like, I don't know, I think I would cringe at myself if I tried to name authors that did this, even though there are some coming to mind, that like, you know, they wrote some, like, they had that one like gargantuous novel that like they tried, it's not like they didn't try to receive capital on during their lifetime. It's that like it's most of the time it's that they tried and that they failed, and it wasn't until decades after their usually early death that they received any kind of like recognition or like monetary compensation for their families and their descendants. So that's a distinction in that like they at least cared about being publicly regarded as like good at what they do. And this like this imagined kind of genius that I'm trying to like assert doesn't even care about that, you know? It's like they don't even care about any of that. None of the incentives to publicize work for them. None of the incentives that like usually get people to balk who naturally don't feel this huge desire to publicize their work, but they do anyway because it's like the incentives are fat. It's like none of that does anything also. And it's fascinating to think about. It really is. It's like I would love to know of a person like this, but knowing of a person like this runs completely contrary to really the qualities of their existence, you know, because like they wouldn't, if their genius was known, then they wouldn't fulfill this criteria of being like an unknown genius, obviously. I'm really saying some good stuff here. I'm saying the stuff that they're not saying. And it also makes me think of like qualities of goodness and like work, and I guess particularly in music, where it's like to everyone who does listen, it kind of seems like just like universally like amazing. And like there are certainly like tons of people living and in history who have like created work that could be described this way. They have created music that could be described this way. I don't know. Again, I'm like holding myself back from saying stuff because I'm like anticipating how cringy or cliche it will sound. But it's like if we just like suppose that there were like, you know, some entity that like assessed just very quickly, was able to like, you know, consume all of the music created by humans throughout history, and also like develop an understanding of like how that was reacted to, you know, and try to notice patterns between like what do people like the most, you know. But it's iffy because a lot of times it's like, you know, there's argument of like people who consider themselves to be whatever, like enjoyers of music that isn't always on the radio. They kind of claim that like the music that they enjoy, like, you know, in like YouTube comment sections are like, this is like the best shit. I don't know why everyone's not listening to this. I don't know why everyone listens to BS. So then there's like, I guess my point is that like there isn't like, at least in my opinion, the best music isn't unanimously the most popular. But it sounds so annoying, I know. But maybe then this would just be an entity that applied to me, and was able to assess all the music I've listened to and my reactions to all of it. And then it's like, it's just without the soul required for all these beautiful pieces to be made, it would be able to produce something that fulfills all the criteria for what I think is like the most gorgeous, profound music. And it would just produce that in like such a like just like a fraction of a second. It would have like, you know, hundreds of tracks that I was able to download that were just like, you know, all just like electronic brilliancies. And it's just nothing to it. And it's such a fascinating thing because it makes you think of like the limitations of our abilities and our like what we can do and what we can create, and how it's all like within like a certain kind of scope. It's like just the idea that like the music that like I think is the best, or that you think is the best, or whoever it is, the music that we hold in the highest esteem, it's like we kind of, without thinking about it, we kind of consider that to be like, I mean, unless you don't really like it, it tends to be the case that you like consider it to be like the best shit that is kind of possible in a way. Not necessarily each one is the best song ever, but it's like it falls into that category of belonging. It falls into the category of being like some of the best shit ever, and because you've never heard anything better, you're like, oh, this is the best that is possible. And so you hold it as like this, you kind of hold it as like a sitting on like the highest rung on like this ladder of quality of music. And then just to even just briefly conceive of, and maybe not even like thoroughly conceive of, this idea that like there exists an entity that isn't limited in the same way that we are, and that what we suppose to be like the highest rung of quality is just like, it's just like nothing at all to them. You know what I mean? And they are able to like create music that is just so many like millions of times more profound. And I guess then there's the question of like, well then would we even be able to perceive of how good it is? And that gets into the whole idea of like the goodness of a song is just like, it has to do with who's listening to it. And I don't know, I don't like that much, because it's like, I mean, it's true and I acknowledge that, but it's like it adds in like another variable that it's like a little complicated to put into this equation a little bit. Yeah. I think that would be interesting. I need water. But I think I want to go back to focusing on things that are at least vaguely more personal to me. I mean, it's all personal to me in that I'm thinking of it and I'm saying it, but like that have to do with like recent emotional states, because in a way I kind of feel like that's like all there is, you know, like, or that's like, I don't know. I don't know, maybe like saying that that's all that's important, or like that's the most important, implies that like I'm in a state of not having to worry about like other things that are like always considered important. I don't know if it's just that, but it's like, it does seem like my kind of position on the happiness to unhappiness scale or spectrum, oh my god, excuse me, it seems like my position on that scale is like kind of the most imperative and important thing, at least in my head. Like to me, not you know, not to other people or to the world or anything, but like to my experience of reality, it's like I want the most to I want to feel good, you know. And it's so funny because it's like, it's one of those things that you can't, it almost feels like you can't really do any like, you know, slimy little philosophizing tricks to work your way around. And it's like, it's because it's like there's this approach that like, you know, everything's complex and multifaceted, but this seems like cut and dry a little bit. Like this seems almost like, of course the desire is to feel good, and to avoid that which would make you feel bad. And so it's like, how, I don't know, how can that be, given that like everything else in its coexistence seems to be so complex and seems to only exist in whatever state it does based on like the angle at which you're looking. How does that work? But it's like I still, if I retract back into myself, I still feel like good and secure and stable. But it's like I'd be lying if I proclaimed that that same goodness was like easily communicable through this medium, or that I've done a good job at communicating it through this medium. Damn, this thing is, they're like working, oh this, hold on, they're working on this thing a lot. It's so ugly, man. It's so horrendous. I mean, it's kind of cool looking though, but also it's ugly. I don't know. Yeah, it's like, again, I feel like I'm falling to the tendency of not being able to like communicate any profound emotional experiences just with my words. And that's like, I don't like that. It's shitty. I don't know, but I think it's not necessarily the case. Like, I have definitely talked about things that aren't just like distant or performative for me. But it's like I'm approaching the point at which I usually start to stop, or not start to stop, I stop, or I start to think about stopping, and I'm feeling like not fully satisfied with it, with what I've done here, and not fully like all I've had to say has been said. So what the heck? There's dust in my eyes. And maybe I I do need to start switching to the longer format, because it's like, if you're gonna do an hour, it's like you're doing just enough that you're kind of winding yourself up, and you're warmed up, and you're in the flow of things, and you've got all these ideas kind of coming to the surface. But you're doing just enough so you get that, but then you just cut it off once you get there. It's almost like the duration that I've been using for this full thing is only like the warm-up period, you know? And maybe I should start doing like, I don't know. And just like kind of getting past these like technical hurdles of like not having a battery pack that suffices. It's like, I can just, if I really wanted to, I could just spend a little bit of money and I would have one, you know? And that would be it. I don't know. I had this sense for a second of like part of the reason that I think I feel restricted and limited in this activity is that there's this kind of just naturally or inherently there's this like need or drive for it to make sense, and not even meaning like all the concepts have to be like sound or, you know, universally understood, but just like making sense in that like the words that I'm saying, or like each sentence seems to follow the previous sentence. It's like maybe holding that qualification over myself always without even thinking about it, of each sentence logically following the previous one, is like, maybe that's a little bit limiting. I'm not sure. I kind of think the reason I said it is because I do feel that way. But it's like, what would that mean for me to, I don't know. What would that mean for me to like, I don't know, because it's like now I've built that up a little bit. Now I'm like, now I've built up this idea of like, you know, there will be a lot of payoff if I just, or this will be so much more fulfilling if I just stop worrying about it making sense. And now it's like, all right, well, let's hear it, you know? Go ahead and stop making sense. Let's see how good it is. And then there's like this added pressure to that like perfectly counteracts and cancels out any like feeling of like alleviated pressure from no longer having to make sense. It's kind of funny. And just keep going. It's like, what if I just tried to take my innermost, like, subjective kind of inklings of like what's profound that only applies to me, in which, you know, each person has, that only applies to them. What if I tried to do that and like convert them into like just these tiny like bits of almost like poetry, and then I just like, that was like all I did here, is I just said those things, you know? Like I just said like little one-off phrases, little one-off phrases that don't seem to have any correlation from one to the next. It's like, would that come across as like interesting somehow, or that, you know, would it come across interesting to me? Would it to the viewer? Or would it feel conceited to me or to the viewer? And it's like also the question of like, why am I kind of over analyzing the potential of this thing before having actually done it? You know, like, what good is that? What is that going to do for me? It's like, why not just try it, you know? But now I'm like, well, come on, guys, there's too much pressure now. Now I gotta, like, first of all, I gotta come up with the little couplets or sonnets or whatever, and then I gotta say them. Then I gotta worry about how I feel about them, how you feel about them. And I gotta think about whether this satisfied all the build-up, you know? But it's like, I'm also like, I can just drop this, and I can, because even realizing what I'm doing is like, I'm talking about abandoning any narrative or sense making from one idea to the next. And in my talking about that, I'm perpetuating the narrative, I'm perpetuating the sense making. And the narrative and the mode of sense making is just talking about abandoning the narrative and the mode of sense making. But I'm never actually doing it. And so it's like, now I'm feeling like the solution to this kind of hole I found myself into, even though there is no hole and there is no me, and I haven't found myself in anything, is just to stop, just to drop it, you know? Like, I can just drop this. Who says I can't just drop this? And I can start talking pretty soon about whatever it is I feel that is more interesting, and there's no harm done and no foul or crime committed. But even in just allowing these things to exist as potential and not real manifestations, it's like, I'm having fun, you know? I realized a few minutes ago, and I was gonna say it, and now I am. I put it off for 2 minutes, now I'm saying it. It's like, I'm having fun with this. It's like, I'm warming up, you know? This is why, okay, I think if I got anything out of doing it this time, it's the understanding that I need to go for more than an hour, or more than an hour and a half, or whatever. Like, that's the most important shit. Because you don't really, I mean, I didn't know this, so I can't blame myself. I did it a few times without realizing this. It's like, you don't really get going until you've gone for a while. So it's like, I need to just, I'm walking in a circle here. Just keep going. But also, don't keep going, and just drop this, and drop any incentive or like obligation you're just like arbitrarily and abstractly like just placing on yourself for no reason. No one's holding this up. No one even knows what you're talking about, what you're thinking, and you don't have to like fulfill anything. You really like don't have to do any of that. There's no blueprint, you know? And when there's no blueprint, it's like, I mean, it's double-sided in the way that everything is, because it's like so incredibly freeing, but also so like intimidatingly overwhelming and imposing and large, and just like, oh my god, there's no blueprint, there's no guideline. What am I supposed to do, you know? Just, I don't know. There's nothing to say here. I mean, I just said that I'm warming up to the point where everything's fun to say, and now I'm saying there's nothing to say. And I guess that's kind of summarizes the experience. I don't know. Again, I'm still like, I'm realizing, and I take these like brief, like 10-second pauses between speaking, and I'm like, just in those pauses, I'm like gaining kind of an understanding of what's been said, because it's like kind of like solidifies itself more and more each second, and then I'm able better to judge it. And you know, ironically, the thing that I concluded as a result of that judgment is that I should stop judging this. It would be much more freeing and profound and abundant if I just let go of all these like unconscious structures and ideas of like how this should be. You know, like it shouldn't be any way. But also it's like, but it could be bad, you know? Like, what if it's bad? Like, if I just talked about like, you know, if I just talked about types of pasta for the entire hour or whatever, hour and a half, would that be no better? I mean, would that be no worse than when I talk about like these supposedly like interesting concepts that are on my mind and like are meaningful to me? And that, I know that's an interesting thing, because it's like, I do that a lot. I think it's like when I assert that something is arbitrary and like there isn't this duality of difference between qualities within this thing, you know, like if I assert that like the quality of these videos are arbitrary and that they're not really different from each other based on like whatever judgment I'm trying to like uphold, as soon as I conclude that, I like come up with this like contradiction or like an objection to it. And the objection is, okay, then why don't I just talk about like pasta or like cookies the entire time? Because, you know, given this argument and given any validity to it, it's like you'd think that would also be no different. So it's like you take something on the extreme end and you use it as a way of like, almost, maybe this is wrong, but it's like for me it's like I use it as a way of proving that it's not as arbitrary as I kind of smugly claim it to be, you know? Sometimes it's really not. But then I mean, this just continues going, because then I can also object to the view that like it's not as arbitrary, and that by being like, you know, if you were just to talk about cookies and pasta the whole time, given what we know that's representing, and given how an informed person, or just like knowing whatever the lore of this, like a person who knows the lore of this would recognize my talking of pasta and cookies for the entire time to be like a signal or a statement, a signal for the kind of ridiculousness of like asserting quality based on content and ascribing like differences to types of content within the same structure. It's like they would take the pasta and cookies and they would be like, oh, like he's clearly using this as like some kind of extreme absurdist way of like claiming that there's no difference between him saying this and him saying like something quote unquote real. So that is to say that there's also an argument in favor of just talking about pasta and cookies, and in favor of this idea that there's no difference between that and anything else I choose to talk about. But then it's also like, well, I mean, you can't not qualify what you mean by difference if you're going to say something like this. And I'm here to say, yes, I can, because I have no idea what the hell I mean by difference. I don't know. I do notice when I do this for a bit, I get this like, I don't know, it sounds like I'm almost being like facetiously like blunt or innocent, but I get this quality of like feeling out of touch with shit. And it's like, in one sense, it's like you could argue like, oh, like, but it's like intellectually stimulating to do something like this. And like, yeah, it is, because I'm like, I'm constantly like thinking of concepts and going through like the brain work of converting them into like understandable words and sentences. So it's like, yeah, it's like, you know, it's like mentally strenuous in a good way, but it also just makes me, it's like I get too caught up in like all these suppositions that I'm making, and it's like I fulfill this same issue that I always criticize of like believing that one's subjective experience is like a little bit more than subjective, and kind of using that to extrapolate to everything, to fit everything, like some narrative. But I'm not sure, because I know from experience, and I know like just anticipating now, drawing on past experience, which at the beginning of the video I said I should never do, but I'm doing it anyway. I know from that like, you know, kind of as soon as I stop doing this and I just, you know, I have that relative relief and luxury of not having to be speaking all the time, and I have the luxury of just being able to think my thoughts and not having to like convert them and reduce them into something that's like can be expressed in like word format or verbalized. Once I have that luxury, it's like I think, or I have felt, you know, I feel good. It's like it's a good break from this like standard way of being, I think. And it reminds you, like, I don't know, it makes me feel grateful to like just be able to think thoughts and not have to talk about them. And I can just, you know, I can just listen to music and look at stuff without feeling like I need to talk about it. But then this also feels like I'm implying that like the act of walking, talking is just this huge chore that I force myself to do under the guise of like some like arbitrary like abundance that I'll maybe one day reach if I continue doing it. And that's not the case. It's like, it's not like I'm like just banging my head against a wall chasing this like ever fleeting fulfillment that I've been promised. It's like I get the fulfillment just from doing it. I'm not like constantly like trying to figure out how to get there. It's like I just get there from doing it. But it's not so, you know, it's not so inconceivably like grand or vast that I can't have like qualms about this. It's so strange. I don't know, man. Again, I'm like thinking about ending the video, but I'm also trying to come up with some, you know, some nice thing to say before I do. Or even if I decide to keep going for 10 or 15 minutes, to come up with the next thing to say that to lead into that final 10 or 15 minutes. And ultimately the conclusion. And it's like, I have to remind myself that if you so much as believe that there's no right thing to say, or that no thing you can say is like in some way worse than anything else, then that will be the case. And then that should just alleviate all this pressure of like, how can I say the most profound thing, you know? It's like, that's just, in theory, it's like understanding that it isn't a thing. It will just get me away from that tendency and that urge and that like impatient kind of desire. Like I could talk about anything, but I'm still hesitant, because I still, no matter what, I'm like upholding these, like I'm kind of squeezing myself through this like tube, and the outside of the tube represents like anything that I could say that would like resonate to me as like cringy, you know? Like if I just started saying like random like phrases, you know, like the frog laughed at the man was delusional, you know, like he picked up his pen and he poked it in the frog's stomach, and then like the frog was over there. Like if I just started saying things like that, I mean, I was gonna say that is just so annoying and embarrassing, but after I did it I was like, this isn't as bad, because I think I hyped it up so much to be a terrible thing, and then once I did it I was like, okay. So again, this is like alluding to the difference between the kind of guaranteed dissonance between like the way you conceive something will be and then the way it turns out to be when you actually do it. And it's interesting. Because I also don't think it's the case that there's like absolutely no warrant in believing that like one's conceptions have some bearing on the way that a thing will turn out to be. Like there's got to be something to that, you know? I don't know. There must be. Come on. Conception equals reality. Right? Right, guys? And now it's like focusing my energy on just allowing this to like peacefully peter out without feeling like there's like a huge profound thing which only allows like a narrow window of opportunity to grasp it or to grab onto it and to use it as like something I'm talking about. I'm allowing myself to like try to resist that urge to think that, and just let this, I know it sounds so like Zen adjacent or whatever. Just let this like peter out without ascribing judgment to that, without ascribing judgment to that quality. I don't know if I've fully actually done that. But like I do know that I would like to, you know? That seems like a good thing to do. And you know me, I only like to do good things. We all only want to do the things that are the good thing to do, and nothing else. But also just sitting for a second, I mean not sitting, but not speaking for a second, and then noticing that like I am growing at peace with what's gone on here, and like going back over in my memory of these concepts I've like talked about, and like feeling somewhat satisfied and okay with the way I took it, you know? And also like making a strange decision in not waiting for the video to end for the period of evaluation of it to begin. It's like just evaluating the video as if it's over while it's still going. And also like recognizing that like that's just, there's actually no difference. Like that's okay too. Now it's like I'm so kind of, I mean, a little bit of this is me trying to will it into existence, but I do feel like I'm on the path towards being like so in love with this quality of just allowing it to peter out, that it's like I want to keep going, you know? And like, it's like, yeah, I'm like, my battery's gonna die, whatever. And like, I technically have things I need to be doing after this instead, but it's like, I don't know if this is even true, actually. I think I want to keep going, especially in like this state of petering out, you know? Like, I want to be so fine with this petering out, and in my wanting to want that, I'm getting ever so close to achieving the status of just wanting it only one time and not two wants. Like, this is petering out, and in that I'm like, it's like, it could almost be like my heart rate's slower, and I'm no longer feeling this pressure of like saying the best stuff and coming up with the most catchy, interesting concepts, or maybe not catchy, but just like meaningful concepts to me to go over. It's like I'm no longer so